The quiet town of Mav Visanti was awakened by the desperate cries of a man. Peering out their windows, residents saw their neighbor, 31-year-old Carlo Lissy, calling for help. He appeared frightened and disoriented, mumbling incoherently and pleading for someone to call the police. As people from nearby homes gathered, Carlo revealed that his entire family had been victimized by intruders who had broken into their home. While waiting for authorities to arrive, the emergency operator instructed Carlo to check if his family members had a pulse and to perform CPR if there were any signs of life. Carlo's response was chilling. He screamed that he would not step inside the house again or touch the bodies. While he had miraculously survived because he was out with friends at a local sports bar watching the soccer match between Italy and England, he mentioned that everything seemed normal when he left his house earlier that night. But upon returning, he found his home in disarray and the lifeless bodies of his 38-year-old wife, Christina, their 5-year-old daughter, and their 1.5-year-old son. Carlo Lissy, born Christina Omas, came into the world on September 17, 1975, in the small northern Italian town of Pavia, becoming the eldest child in her family. From a young age, she exhibited a strong-willed, independent, and highly ambitious nature, always marching to the beat. She possessed leadership qualities and was constantly striving to excel in whatever she undertook, whether it was her schoolwork, performances in the drama club, or any day-to-day activities. Christina was someone who always had a wide circle of friends, thanks to her excellent organizational skills and the ability to lead. After finishing high school, she was accepted into a prestigious university in Milan and soon moved out of her parents' home to start an independent life. Despite this, she maintained a close relationship with her family, staying in constant touch, and her parents knew they could always rely on their eldest daughter. At the age of 19, while still attending university, Christina took a job at a branch of a major Italian insurance company located in Mav Visanti. She quickly earned the respect of her superiors and colleagues, and her career was on a fast track to success. Upon graduation, she had a wide array of opportunities before her, but instead of moving to a big city, she chose to stay closer to home in the countryside. By this time, she had already received a promotion at work and assumed a managerial position, becoming a leading specialist in the field of civil insurance. However, even as she grew into an adult and a successful woman, Christina never gave up her youthful passion for theater. She dedicated all her spare time to rehearsals and performing on stage, particularly enjoying musical productions due to her strong voice and impeccable musical ear. In Mav Visanti, she had her admirers and was sometimes even recognized on the streets. Yet Christina's personal life didn't seem to fall into place as smoothly. She had many suitors and occasional romances, but most of the men she encountered seemed frivolous, unreliable, and unsuitable for a serious relationship or family life. She held on to the belief that she would eventually find her true love and achieve happiness. And so it happened. She met a man who she liked right away. It was Carlo Lissy entered the world in the fall of 1982 in the Italian commune of Casarano as the eldest of 2 sons in his family. The family patriarch held conservative views, was quite strict, and even harsh with his children. Carlo's younger brother quickly became the parents' darling, constantly pampered and protected, while they demanded unquestioning obedience, stellar academic performance, and high achievements from their firstborn. From childhood, Carlo strived to meet his parents' expectations, always acting as instructed. He excelled academically, participated in volleyball, a sport his father chose for him despite Carlo's passion for soccer, and never argued with his father, who often stated that his house operated solely on his rules. It was easy to upset or anger their father, who became terrifying when enraged. So Carlo made it a point never to contradict him, always enviously observing his father's and mother's more affectionate treatment towards his younger brother. As a teenager, Carlo became nervous and withdrawn, dreaming of doing something on his own, yet fearing his father's wrath. His fears, internal struggles, and self-doubt affected his relationships with peers. Carlo had almost no friends at school, where he was seen as an uninteresting nerd, often openly bullied without the ability to defend himself, as his father had crushed his self-esteem and suppressed any desire to assert himself. Over time, Carlo learned to adapt and blend in. He avoided conflict, tried to merge with the crowd, and was superficially polite and kind even to those he despised. It seemed Carlo had lost his own emotions, or perhaps never had them. Laughing or mourning with others, his emotional responses always remained shallow because he never truly felt those emotions. Despite his troubled upbringing, after completing high school, Carlo enrolled in the economics faculty of a prestigious university. This choice, like so many others in his life, was dictated by his father, who saw economics as a respectable and lucrative field. Carlo, however, had no interest in numbers or finance. He was never consulted about his preferences, nor did he dare challenge his father's decision. Over time, he grew accustomed to acting against his own interests, prioritizing compliance over his own happiness. Physically, Carlo was strikingly attractive, a trait that didn't go unnoticed by those around him. Years of sports and regular gym sessions gave him an athletic build, while his dazzling smile and well-groomed appearance added to his charm. This handsomeness, paired with a superficial charisma, often drew people to him, though few could see beyond the surface. His looks led to a sense of self-importance, fostering excessive self-love, and what some would later describe as clinical narcissism. When Carlo met Christina, their contrasting personalities created an immediate spark. Christina's confidence and independence stood in stark contrast to Carlo's reserved and compliant nature. Yet, beneath his unassuming exterior, Carlo carried the seeds of something darker, traits that Christina, in her optimism, believed she could mend. Notable trait of Carlo was his remarkable skill in dodging uncomfortable questions. While he wasn't a pathological liar, his ability to prevaricate and evade made him an enigma to many. His impassive demeanor lent an air of credibility to his words, creating an illusion of honesty even when he wasn't forthcoming. People who knew Carlo personally later recalled his diminished capacity for empathy. He often came across as callous and indifferent to the troubles and sorrows of others, including those closest to him. His responses to emotional situations were superficial at best, suggesting a fundamental inability or unwillingness to connect on a deeper level. Carlo easily initiated flings with women, using his appearance and charm to his advantage. However, he was incapable of engaging in serious long-term relationships. There were several reasons for this. First, Carlo went out of his way to avoid responsibility. Second, he had no interest in making long-term plans, preferring to simply go with the flow. Third, his emotional shallowness and lack of real attachment became evident to his partners, who often chose to end the relationship. As a result, his romantic life was a series of brief, superficial encounters that rarely lasted more than a few months. Even after graduating from university, Carlo showed no desire to leave his parents' home. He continued living under their roof, displaying little interest in starting an independent life or building a family of his own. Despite this, he secured a job at a leading IT company in Milan. The position offered a good salary and promising prospects, but Carlo remained dissatisfied. His work felt unfulfilling, a sentiment he often kept to himself. His parents, however, were thrilled. For the first time, Carlo's father seemed genuinely proud of his eldest son, which only reinforced Carlo's reluctance to voice any discontent. Eager to avoid conflicts or criticism, he focused on meeting his parents' expectations, no matter the cost to his own aspirations. But career achievements alone weren't enough for Carlo's parents. They began pressuring him to marry and provide them with grandchildren. Aware of his numerous fleeting affairs and his inability to sustain a serious relationship, these conversations often led to arguments at home. Carlo, ever averse to confrontation, assured them he would find a wife and start a family soon. This reassurance, however, was little more than a way to deflect their demands and buy himself time. Carlo's life took a dramatic turn when he first laid eyes on Christina Omas during her performance in a musical play. Her powerful charisma and stunning vocal talent captivated him instantly. For the first time in years, Carlo felt something resembling admiration, though he lacked the courage to approach her after the show. Fate, however, had other plans. A few weeks later, mutual friends introduced them, setting the stage for a whirlwind romance. At the time of their meeting, Carlo was only 23, while Christina was already 30. The significant age difference didn't seem to matter as they quickly developed a strong connection. Christina, who had spent much of her life focusing on her career, found herself unexpectedly longing for a family and children. Carlo, with his good looks, career orientation, and intelligence, seemed like the perfect partner. She viewed his hesitancy, dependency, noticeable selfishness, and emotional coldness as challenges she could help him overcome. Taking the initiative in their relationship, Christina became the driving force behind their plans, while Carlo compliantly followed her lead. Their relationship progressed quickly, and within a few months, Christina introduced Carlo to her family. Her parents, however, were less than impressed. They saw Carlo as frivolous and immature, with Christina's mother describing him as a child in a man's body. She believed her daughter deserved a more emotionally mature and reliable partner, someone capable of providing genuine support. Christina, however, disagreed. True to her nature, she followed her heart, convinced that Carlo was the one for her. On the other hand, Carlo's parents were thrilled with their son's choice. Christina was seen as a responsible, accomplished, and self-sufficient woman who could compensate for Carlo's shortcomings. Even Carlo's father, who was notoriously difficult to please, approved of the relationship. This validation further convinced Carlo that he had made the right decision, even if he didn't fully understand what that decision entailed. About a year after meeting, the young couple moved in together and began actively planning their wedding. Carlo was quiet and compliant, always listening to his fiancée, never contradicting her, and carefully avoiding domestic disputes. Christina made all the decisions, while Carlo silently supported them. This arrangement suited her perfectly. She was confident that a long and happy life awaited them. She viewed Carlo's lack of initiative as endearing, believing it signaled his trust in her judgment. However, just before their wedding, Carlo revealed his true nature for the first time, nearly causing them to split. Before the wedding, Carlo's friends organized a bachelor party in one of Milan's popular nightclubs. The evening was filled with revelry as they drank, laughed, and celebrated Carlo's impending marriage. As the night wore on, a group of women joined their party. One of them, particularly bold and flirtatious, set her sights on the groom-to-be. Carlo, though initially reserved, was encouraged by his inebriated friends, who egged him on with crude jokes about enjoying one last fling before settling down. Yielding to peer pressure, Carlo left with the woman and spent a passionate night with her in a nearby hotel. The following morning, in a moment of emotional confusion, Carlo confessed his love to the casual lover, promising to leave his fiancée for her. Driven by an inexplicable urge to unburden himself, Carlo returned home and confessed everything to Christina. He told her he had fallen for someone else and no longer wanted to go through with the wedding. The revelation was a devastating blow. Christina handled the shocking news with remarkable dignity. She packed her belongings, determined not to plead or beg, and temporarily moved back to her parents' house while she looked for a place of her own. She believed the betrayal spoke volumes about Carlo's character and saw no future with him. When Carlo's father learned of his son's actions and the broken engagement, he was furious. He berated Carlo, declaring that he wouldn't allow his heir to ruin his reputation and that of their family. Carlo's father demanded that his son apologize to Christina and convince her to resume the engagement. Carlo, accustomed to submitting to his father's will, complied without hesitation. Armed with a massive bouquet of flowers, he went to the Omas residence to beg for Christina's forgiveness. Christina's parents, already disapproving of Carlo, were adamantly opposed to the reconciliation. They saw his behavior as proof of his immaturity and selfishness. However, Christina made the final decision. After much thought, she chose to forgive Carlo, convinced that everyone deserves a second chance. The wedding went ahead as planned, and the couple used the money gifted by relatives to purchase their own home in Mav Visanti. For a while, their marital life appeared blissful. Both held high-ranking positions with substantial salaries, allowing them to enjoy not only life's necessities, but also luxuries such as travel and entertainment. In 2009, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Giulia. 4 years later, in 2013, Christina gave birth to a son, Gabriel. To the outside world, the Lissys seemed like the epitome of a happy family. They projected an image of love and harmony, with Carlo playing the role of a devoted husband and father. Christina appeared content, confident that they had overcome their earlier challenges. But beneath this facade, Carlo was leading a double life. At home, he was the perfect family man, spending time with his wife and children and carefully maintaining an image of stability. However, in Milan, where he commuted daily for work, Carlo transformed into someone entirely different. He frequently engaged in flings and casual encounters, meeting women in cafes, shopping centers, or even on the street. The handsome, stylishly dressed man in his expensive car almost always received reciprocated interest. But these affairs typically ended after a few dates. Carlo enjoyed the control and dominance in these short-term relationships, deciding when to see his next conquest and when to leave her. At home, Christina continued to hold the reins of their relationship. Carlo's compliance masked his inner dissatisfaction, which he kept hidden from his wife. He justified his infidelities as harmless distractions, convincing himself that his actions didn't truly affect his family. However, rumors of his escapades eventually reached Christina. She confronted him on multiple occasions, but Carlo vehemently denied the accusations, dismissing them as baseless gossip. In 2013, shortly after Gabriel's birth, Carlo's dissatisfaction reached a tipping point. He seriously contemplated leaving his family for one of his mistresses. Emboldened by his feelings for the woman, he admitted his intentions to Christina. However, Christina responded with compelling arguments against separation. She emphasized the emotional toll it would take on their children and how the decision would devastate Carlo's parents. Carlo, who could never bear to disappoint his father, ultimately conceded to her reasoning. Once again, he chose the path of least resistance, suppressing his desires in favor of preserving appearances. A year later, in early 2014, a new employee named Maria joined Carlo's workplace. Young, attractive, and vibrant, Maria's presence immediately caught Carlo's attention. He became infatuated, unable to think of anything or anyone else. Her youth and energy contrasted sharply with what he perceived as the mundane routines of his married life. Carlo, captivated, began making attempts to win her over, gifting small tokens of appreciation, offering excessive compliments, and persistently asking her out. Maria, however, was firm in her refusals. She made it clear that she had no interest in pursuing a relationship with a married co-worker who had 2 children. But Carlo, unwilling to accept rejection, ignored her boundaries and continued his relentless pursuit. Carlo's obsession with Maria deepened. His perception of his own life began to sour. He started viewing his wife, Christina, and their children as the central barriers to his happiness. What once was love and responsibility now felt, to Carlo, like confinement and resentment. In his mind, Maria symbolized freedom, passion, and a chance at a fresh start, a life unburdened by the demands of marriage and fatherhood. These fantasies consumed him, and his growing resentment toward Christina and their children left him increasingly detached from the family that had once been his entire world. In a desperate attempt to make his fantasies a reality, Carlo brought up the subject of divorce with Christina once again. He hoped that she would finally relent and grant him an escape from what he had come to see as a suffocating existence. Christina, however, was as practical and family-oriented as ever. She dismissed the idea, arguing that divorce would not only shatter their seemingly stable life, but also wreak emotional havoc on their children. To her, their family unit was sacred, and she believed that working through their struggles together was the only viable option. Carlo, unable to counter her logic, reluctantly conceded, though his frustration and resentment festered beneath the surface. Unwilling to let go of his dream of a new life, Carlo began consulting divorce lawyers in secret. His intention was to find a way out of his marriage that would allow him to pursue Maria without losing everything. Legal consultations revealed that separating from Christina would be financially disastrous. Under the law, half of his assets would become hers, and he would be obligated to pay substantial child support for Julia and Gabriel. For a man already consumed by selfish fantasies, the financial burden of divorce was simply unacceptable. Frustrated and unwilling to compromise his imagined future, Carlo's thoughts turned dark. Late at night, while Christina and the children slept, he began researching ways to eliminate his problem. He delved into criminal stories and forums, looking for inspiration. One case in particular caught his attention: an armed robbery in Mav Visanti, where the perpetrators had fatally stabbed the homeowner before escaping undetected. The crime remained unsolved, and Carlo began to envision how he could recreate such a scenario to solve his own predicament. A monstrous plan began to take shape, one where Christina and the children would be the victims, and Carlo would emerge free to start a new life. Friday, June 13th, 2014, began like any other day for the Lissy family. Carlo, who had taken the day off from work, made a deliberate decision to spend it with his family. Their day unfolded with visits to an amusement park, a shopping spree at the local mall, and a delightful dinner at a popular cafe in town. Carlo was particularly meticulous in orchestrating their activities to ensure they were seen by as many people as possible, carefully curating the image of a happy and loving family. Observers noted their genuine joy and the harmonious interactions that seemed to epitomize familial bliss. Upon returning home, The evening continued with routine as the children were tucked into their rooms on the second floor, their peaceful slumber undisturbed. Carlo and Christina then retreated to the living room, sharing an intimate moment. This encounter was a calculated maneuver by Carlo, designed to create a facade of consensual intimacy. His strategy was cunning. He was convinced that no one would suspect a man who had been visibly affectionate and physically close to his wife. As the night progressed, Christina believed that Carlo was preparing to leave for a soccer match with his friends, a regular occurrence that she expected. She settled into the living room to watch television, completely unaware of the impending horror that would shatter her sense of security and trust. According to investigators who later delved into the details of the case, Carlo did not leave the house as Christina had assumed. Instead, he quietly moved to the kitchen and retrieved a large knife. With calculated silence, he approached Christina from behind and stabbed her in the side of the neck. To his surprise, Christina did not succumb immediately. She let out a scream and attempted to flee, initially unaware of her attacker's identity. When she turned to see Carlo standing there with the knife, her expression transformed into one of utter disbelief and terror. Christina fought back with every ounce of strength she possessed. In the ensuing struggle, she managed to dislodge the knife, causing Carlo's hand to slip and injure his palm. Despite her valiant efforts, the strength disparity between them proved too great. Carlo seized the knife once more and continued his brutal assault until Christina collapsed, lifeless. Her final moments were engulfed in confusion and fear, unable to comprehend why the man she had trusted so deeply had betrayed her so violently. Fueled by adrenaline, Carlo then proceeded upstairs to the children's rooms. He first entered Giulia's room, his daughter, and then Gabriel's room, his son. Both children were asleep, unaware of the nightmare unfolding around them. Carlo methodically slit their throats with clinical precision, ensuring that their deaths were instantaneous and sparing them the trauma of witnessing their mother's murder. Experts later concluded that their deaths were swift, preventing them from experiencing the horror that had befallen their family. Some neighbors later confessed to hearing muffled screams that night, but none took immediate action by calling the police. They assumed the noises had ceased and dismissed them as insignificant, an inaction that, while understandable, sealed the family's tragic fate. With his grisly task complete, Carlo turned his attention to staging the scene to resemble a robbery. He scattered items, moved furniture, and even attempted to wipe his fingerprints from the murder weapon. However, his efforts were poorly executed and incomplete. He managed to clean the bloodstains from the floor where he had stepped, but failed to notice the tiny splatters on his clothing. Exhausted, he made his way to a rarely used basement shower to cleanse himself of the immediate evidence. In a perplexing oversight, Carlo put back on the same shirt he had worn during the murders, which bore small blood splatters that he had failed to notice amid the chaos of his actions. This crucial mistake would later become a significant piece of evidence against him. Following this, Carlo bandaged the cut on his palm, a wound sustained during his violent struggle with Christina, before methodically dressing in clean clothes. He then left the house and headed to a nearby sports bar to watch a football match and enjoy a beer with friends. To any observer, Carlo appeared entirely normal. He laughed, cheered, and engaged in casual conversations, blending seamlessly with the lively crowd. His friends, who were later called to testify in court, were shocked upon learning about the heinous crime he had committed just hours earlier. They described him as calm and jovial that evening, unable to reconcile his outward demeanor with the horrific acts he had carried out. Towards the end of the match, Carlo sent several text messages to his wife's phone. In them, he updated her on the score and even professed his love, writing that he would be home soon. These messages were part of his carefully constructed alibi, designed to reinforce the illusion that he had been at the sports bar all night, unaware of the tragedy unfolding at home. Carlo returned to his house around 3 a.m. and staged a dramatic discovery of the crime scene. Running out into the street, he began screaming loudly, his cries piercing the quiet of the early morning. The commotion quickly attracted the attention of his neighbors, many of whom woke up and rushed outside to investigate. Alarmed, the neighbors called the police and emergency medical services. While waiting for authorities to arrive, the emergency operator instructed Carlo to check if his family members had a pulse and to perform CPR if there were any signs of life. Carlo's response was chilling. He screamed that he would not step inside the house again or touch the bodies. His reaction, while perhaps attributable to shock, struck many as peculiar. Even more unsettling was the fact that he referred to his family as bodies before anyone had officially confirmed their deaths. When police and medical personnel arrived and officially pronounced Christina and the children dead, Carlo's behavior raised further suspicions. He barely reacted to the devastating news, his face a mask of indifference. Attempts to feign grief were unconvincing. He contorted his features as though trying to cry, but his eyes remained dry and his demeanor oddly detached. When questioned about the events of the night, Carlo struggled to provide a coherent timeline. His statements were riddled with inconsistencies, and he seemed unable to recall even basic details about his movements. Adding to the growing suspicion, Carlo confessed to having recorded the discovery of the crime scene on his phone. He asserted that the footage would serve as undeniable proof of his innocence, capturing his genuine reaction upon finding the bodies of his family members. However, this ill-conceived strategy disastrously backfired. The video, which Carlo had neglected to stop recording, contradicted his testimony in several crucial aspects. The footage clearly showed that he did not approach Christina's body to check for a pulse, nor did he ascend the stairs to evaluate the condition of the children. Instead, he immediately fled the scene, running outside in an exaggerated display of panic that seemed more performative than genuine. Carlo's initial assertion that the murders were the result of a robbery was swiftly dismissed during the preliminary stages of the investigation. A thorough forensic examination of the crime scene revealed no evidence of forced entry. All doors and windows were found to be intact, indicating that the perpetrator had unimpeded access to the house. Additionally, nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. Christina's jewelry box, cash, and other valuables remained untouched, and the disarray within the home appeared to be artificially staged. Items were toppled or displaced in a manner that suggested no sincere attempt to search for valuables. Perhaps most damning of all was the absence of any credible motive for intruders to harm the children, who had been peacefully asleep in their beds at the time of the attack. As the evidence continued to accumulate, the case was rapidly reclassified from a possible robbery to a deliberate act of homicide, with Carlo emerging as the primary suspect. His inconsistent and contradictory statements did little to bolster his defense. When questioned about the fresh cut on his palm, Carlo provided a feeble explanation, claiming that he had injured himself while hastily running out of the house. However, forensic analysis of his clothing revealed tiny blood splatters on the back of his shirt, a pattern that was consistent with the motion of the knife during the attack and impossible to reconcile with his narrative of fleeing the scene. The video Carlo had provided to the authorities further undermined his defense, as it showed that he never attempted to check for signs of life, directly contradicting his claims of discovering his family already deceased. Despite this overwhelming evidence, Carlo maintained that he had found his family dead and was certain that they had been killed with a knife. Investigators also uncovered a bloodied cloth in the trash, which Carlo had used to clean up after the murders. This, along with the bloodstains on his underwear and the inconsistencies in the staging of the crime scene, ultimately sealed his fate. Following his arrest, Carlo's attempts to feign grief completely ceased. Once in custody, he exhibited an eerie calmness, showing no signs of guilt or remorse. In his cell, he simply lay down and went to sleep, presenting a chilling contrast to the horrific acts he had committed just hours earlier. Carlo's indifference extended to his interrogations, where he steadfastly maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Investigators observed his lack of emotion when discussing his wife and children, describing him as cold and detached. A meticulous reconstruction of Carlo's search history, derived from the data on his seized laptop, provided investigators with a chilling timeline of his descent into planning the murders of his family. The search queries included investigations into untraceable poisons, detailed anatomy of fatal wounds, and in-depth accounts of other violent crimes. Each search, each click, delved deeper into his malicious intent, leaving no doubt that the murders were premeditated. Despite this clear evidence of planning, the underlying motive for Carlo's actions remained an unsettling mystery that perplexed investigators and the community alike. As the weight of the irrefutable evidence bore down on him, Carlo eventually abandoned his facade of innocence. Recognizing the futility of further denial, he began to confess. His calm, almost clinical explanation of how he had murdered his loved ones sent shockwaves through the room. Carlo recounted each step of the crime without displaying any emotion, describing the acts as though they were routine events. However, it was his justification, his motive, that truly horrified everyone present. They spoke of a twisted sense of control and a misguided belief that he was acting in the best interest of his family, painting a disturbing picture of his warped psyche. Explaining why he decided to murder his family, Carlo revealed that he felt trapped by his obligations. Divorce, in his mind, was an unacceptable option. He reasoned that ending his marriage would require him to split their jointly acquired property, including the house, cars, and the family bank account. Such a loss was intolerable to him. Additionally, Carlo saw his children as burdens, citing the child support payments he would owe as another insurmountable obstacle to his imagined happiness with Maria. He viewed his family not as people he loved or cared for, but as liabilities that needed to be eliminated. To Carlo, the solution was horrifyingly simple: commit a crime, stage a robbery, and free himself from the life he had come to resent. He did not hesitate, did not stammer. His tone was eerily calm as he explained how he had justified such horrific actions to himself. The investigators listening to his confession were struck by the absence of remorse in his words. He showed no pity for his children, no sorrow for his wife, and no acknowledgement of the profound loss he had caused. Psychiatrists who examined Carlo concluded that he was a psychopath, a man entirely devoid of empathy. However, they also determined that he was sane at the time of the crime. The psychiatric evaluation confirmed that Carlo was fully aware of his actions and understood the consequences of what he was doing. He had planned the murders with clear intent and executed them with chilling precision. What he lacked entirely was guilt or regret. At no point during or after the crime did Carlo experience even a flicker of remorse. As the investigation progressed, more details about Carlo's behavior emerged. Friends and acquaintances recalled moments where his lack of empathy had been subtly apparent, though never alarming enough to raise red flags. He was described as charming but shallow, a man who could feign interest and emotion but rarely formed deep connections. In hindsight, many realized that his charm was a facade, a tool he used to manipulate those around him. Despite his stoicism, Carlo attempted to defend his actions during the trial. He repeatedly emphasized his belief that he had been left with no other choice, portraying himself as a victim of circumstances that had relentlessly cornered him. His father was the central figure in this tragic history, a man whose constant attacks, both verbal and emotional, had started in his early childhood and continued into adulthood. These assaults went beyond mere criticism. They were deeply ingrained patterns of control and domination that eroded his sense of autonomy. Every decision in his life, he claimed, had been overshadowed by his father's oppressive influence. This ceaseless interference, he argued, stripped him of the ability to chart his own path, fostering a deep-seated resentment and a sense of helplessness that grew over the years. In January 2015, Carlo was sentenced to life in prison. He listened to the judge's verdict indifferently, noting only that he thought so. Sometime later, the man tried to file an appeal, but soon withdrew it himself, saying that it was all useless. Finally, Lissy's father died of a heart attack shortly after his son was convicted and sent to prison. He simply could not accept the fact that he had raised a real monster, devoid of a sense of pity and remorse.